John Ketwig is retired from an automotive career. He's a lifelong member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He's a member of Veterans for Peace, and he's the author of And a Hard Rain Fell, a GI's true story of the war in Vietnam. We're going to talk mostly about the Ken Burns series, The Vietnam War, and some of John's background. So welcome, John, and thanks for speaking with me.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Great. Do you want to tell people listening how you ended up in Vietnam?
Okay. I had a number of scholarships at the end of my high school career, but didn't have the financial ability to go on to college, and really wasn't that excited about it either. I'm a car nut, have always been a car nut, and I wanted to get under the hood of a car and try to understand how they worked and what would make them work better and all of that. So my father got sick. There wasn't money to go to college. I got a job at an area Chevy dealership, and I was in hog heaven. I got paid to drive sometimes 427 Corvettes or Chevelles and really neat cars, and get under the hood with the mechanics and so forth. So I was on a career path, let us say. I had long hair and a set of drums, and I was playing with a couple of different bands at different times and just waiting. I thought that one day, magically, we would be discovered and be America's answer to the Beatles, and I'm still waiting for that to happen. But along came the draft, and just threatened to pull me away from my entire life. I was not the guy they wanted. I, like most of the young men at that time, and we're talking 1966, didn't want to be part of their army. I was tall and skinny and not mentally ready to go and kill people or be threatened with being killed myself. This was a very, very colorful, fun time with the rock and roll music. My buddy had a very top quality drag racing car. We went to the Nationals at Indianapolis and everything. Obviously, at that age, I was very involved with girls, and the idea of being shipped to the other side of the world and have people shoot at me just didn't appeal in the least. I was not interested. Did everything I could to avoid it, short of utterly refusing, which I wish now I had done, or, escaping to Canada or something like that. We lived in a small town, western New York. If I had done something like that, the repercussions for my family would have been very hard for them to take. So you reach a point where you just say, look, I'm certainly not the only one. And I guess I'll go and I'll try to make the best of it. And hopefully the recruiter, I ended up enlisting actually, David, but the recruiter said, oh, you'll probably go to Germany and you'll be in a barracks. It'll be like a college dorm, and you'll end up having a really wonderful experience in our army. So I was boxed in. There was no place to go. It was certain that I would be drafted. I was walking and breathing in 1A, so there wasn't much chance of getting away. And I enlisted to get training as a wheel and truck mechanic And on December 30th, 1966, I raised my right hand and I was in the Army. Went through school and all of that. Basic was a very horrendous experience, being exposed to some things that I had never seen before, and a group of people from all kinds of backgrounds, and of course, you had to figure out how to get along with them. I found the Army extremely demanding and unrealistic. We were sent out, there was a heavy snowfall, let's say a foot of snow one night. We were sent out, the uniform of the day was combat boots and your boxer shorts. And they handed out dustpans, and we had to shovel the parking lot with dustpans before, this is like 3 or 4 in the morning, before everybody came to work and wanted to park their cars. When a lot of guys got serious colds or pneumonia, whatever it might be, if you went on the sick call, you were punished for it. And to me, I mean, that ended any enthusiasm I might have had for the military, and it got worse from there. We had a young man commit suicide. It was just atrocious. But I was trapped. I was in. There was no way out. So I went to school in Aberdeen, Maryland. That wasn't at all bad. It wasn't where I wanted to be, but it was, learning and with a good bunch of guys. And I had volunteered for officer candidate school, because I figured if I'm going to do this amount of time, it would not add to my time that I had to spend. I might as well get officer pay and whatever. Well, they canceled the class and gave me orders to go to Vietnam. So and I got on the plane and at Fort Dix, and we went through Alaska in tropical weight uniforms. We were outside in Alaska's cold, and then we went to Japan and then on to Vietnam, and that's how I got there.
So before we get to your actual experience in Vietnam, what was the mood like in the United States when you were going? Was there the impression that the war was just this far off thing that probably wasn't a good thing, but was there a lot of anti-war sentiment from the idea that this war is morally wrong, or were most people at that point this was just another war that America was involved in and people were still feeling a little patriotic?
No, not that at all. There was World War II, and the feeling was always very much that that was worthwhile, and we stopped Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese emperor, and it was the right thing to do. And the seeds were sown to call those guys the greatest generation of all. And then there was Korea. Nobody talked about that much, but that was a long time ago. Korea happened, the very early 50s. I was born in 1948. The mood in America, I would say, was, what the heck is this? Coming and trying to interfere in my life. I think that time period is extremely important because we were the first generation of American soldiers to have socially relevant music. Call it the protest music, but an emphasis in music of get along with each other, do the right thing. We're all citizens of the world, and There was the civil rights upset, and just a whole lot of things that made for that colorful time, the very exciting time that I talked about before. There was not an organized anti-war peace movement at that time, certainly not that I was aware of. And at that time, I was working in Rochester, New York. I can talk about that community in the feel, about, it may have been different in other parts of America, but my experience throughout my military experience was that 95% of all the guys that were there, and there were very, very few women at that point. I never really remember seeing one, but 95% of all the guys that had to deal with the military were opposed to taking part and to the war in Vietnam. There certainly was no feeling that, oh boy, we've got to go fight the communists on the other side of the world. I need to do my patriotic duty and take part in that. I understand there are guys who felt that way, but they were a distinct minority. We were very involved in a lot of things. And I've mentioned cars and I've mentioned rock and roll. We were the first generation of American soldiers to have an automobile home in the driveway when we went to war. We were the first to have televisions. When we were growing up as kids, television came along. The neighbor got one first, and we would get off the school bus and put down our lunchbox and run over to their house to see Mickey Mouse Club at, 4 o'clock in the afternoon or something. We were brought up on Captain Kangaroo and Hopalong Cassidy, Roy Rogers, and I really attribute a hell of a lot to that we watched all of these programs, and the message over and over was the good guys always win. If you do the right thing, if you stand up for what's good and right and all of that, you'll triumph in the end. And so, you hear a lot about, oh, you have that 60s idealism. Yes, I do. And, that's what we were taught, was to do the right thing. And we were all involved in something very exciting, whether it was college or career or whatever. Boy, what a colorful, wonderful time to be young and starting into a career path or the direction for the rest of your life. And the Army and the draft threatened to just trash all of that, just to absolutely yank you out of your entire existence, all your hopes and plans, and force you to do something that you didn't want to do. So it was very adversarial in that respect. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
No, absolutely. I am fascinated about the culture of the time, but just one more question before we get into your actual experience in Vietnam. What was, just briefly, what was some of the music you were listening to at that time? Can you name some of the bands that you were trying to maybe emulate and some of the stuff that you enjoyed listening to?
Oh, absolutely. The Beatles were a huge phenomenon. The Rolling Stones, the Rascals, the Byrds, Sonny and Cher. Boy, it was a huge list. That was a time when rock and roll music became a real art form and began to be taken very seriously with the music that these guys were making, what they were saying in their lyrics and everything. So it was very, very much a part of our culture as young people. And I'll point out, David, that the vast majority, the biggest numbers of Americans landed in Vietnam, in 1969 or 68 after the Tet Offensive. The average age was about 19. If you get out your calculator and figure that out, at about 13, 14, 15 years old, Kennedy was assassinated, and then 50-some days later, if I remember right, it was 54 days, I think, the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. And that was our generation's transition. The Beatles weren't talking about social topics and so forth at that point very much, but it was ready to come. And of course, the other one is Bob Dylan. The things he was saying, he was the spokesperson for our generation, and now all of a sudden they've recognized his contribution to all of that and given him a Nobel Prize for Literature. So, and his importance was enormous.
Right. So, okay, so we left, you had first flown to Japan, and then you went to Vietnam. Do you want to tell us where the plane landed and go from there about how long were you in Vietnam?
Well, the plane landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. We got off the plane and got on buses to be taken over to what they call the replacement facility, and the buses had wire mesh on the windows, and somewhere along the line somebody yelled to the driver, what is this with this screen on the windows? And he said, that's so that people won't throw a grenade in. And it's like, wait a minute. I thought we were here to help these people if they'd be on our side. Until that moment, I think most of us, I certainly had the impression that the Vietnamese people would be kind of like, you saw the people on the street in Paris when the GIs rode in and they had kicked the Nazis out, and they were tossing flowers and all of that type. Well, it wasn't that way. The Vietnamese people despised us, saw us as just another foreign colonial power, and they wanted us out. So immediately, within half an hour after getting off the plane, you were confronted with the fact that, boy, these people don't like you and will look for an opportunity to kill you. And Jesus, made the year ahead look like a long, long time.
So where were you? Do you want to tell us about, you wrote this really great article called Ken Burns, Vietnam and a Bowl of Popcorn, because you're talking about your experience watching the Ken Burns show, but you talk a little bit about what it was like in Vietnam and some of the things you saw. What was your experience with the actual war itself?
Well, again, I was a truck and track vehicle mechanic when I first arrived there, and I was stationed in Pleiku, very near to 4th Division camp, but we had our own separate facility. And our job was to repair the trucks that were running convoys, bringing supplies from Quy Nhon up to Pleiku, and then from Pleiku, basically up to Dak To. And the roads were, dirt and very crude. They would shake the trucks apart. It was either deep mud, or later on it would become very dusty in the dry season. It was very hard on vehicles, and our job was to keep them on the road, hang them back together, and get them ready to go. So later on, it was found out that I had done body and fender work and painting and so forth on the outside, and they were in desperate need of that, so they transferred me over, and I became a body and fender man. And related with that, along with that, was welding, and I learned to be a fairly good welder, what I would call certified. So we did, a lot of work with that. And had a number of instances. The convoys were being attacked fairly regularly. I'll mention that when I first went up to Docto, and by now it was probably October, I have pictures that I took where the trees actually hang on both sides of the road so close that they would hit the mirrors on I was driving the equivalent of a 18-wheeler type of thing, and with the side mirrors out, the trees would brush against them on both sides of the road. Later on, they bush hogged a wide shoulder on both sides, and you sprayed it with Agent Orange and whatever, and got rid of all those places to hide. But it was a scary ride. I had an occasion in November when a truck right in front of me hit a mine, and we were all hauling ammo up to Docto. It was at the time of the Battle of Hill 875, and things were very extreme, and we're hauling ammo, and this guy hit a mine, and it exploded big time right in front of me. Somehow I drove through it and came out the other side, and everybody stopped and went back, and there was this gigantic hole in the ground. I can't explain how I got through that, but I did, and then had to get back in the truck and go on to Docto, where it was horrendous. Incoming rockets and mortars, and just utter, call it combat chaos. Mud up to your knees, the whole world was just ooze and water, and this incoming, and guys desperate. We were supposed to give like 10 boxes of ammo at each gun point, and they jumped on the truck and threw everything off, immediately. Hey, we need this stuff, so it was a very desperate night. Where I spent the night with them in a trench, and watched an armored personnel carrier go outside the wire and open the back door. Had rope they would tie around the GI body's ankle and drag them over to the next one, and the next one was like a stringer of fish when I was a kid and went fishing, and dragged them out of there because they were under fire, and it was the only way to retrieve the bodies. Horrendous, just incredible to see. Fire kept coming in all night, whatever. So it was a very, very horrendous trip, and very scary. I could go on. I don't know how much time and whatever. When I first got to Pleiku, they put the new guy on garbage detail. So we went around. They had 55-gallon drums used as garbage cans everywhere, and we emptied all of them into the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck and headed off to the dump, which was a big ditch bulldozed out, and you backed up to it. It was, I'm going to say, probably 20 feet deep, and you threw your garbage out into this gigantic hole. Well, there were 30 or 40 Vietnamese civilians down underneath there going through it looking for anything to eat. There were ARVN, or South Vietnamese Army guards around, and they, for whatever reason, I assume they were ordered to tell people they couldn't take anything with them. And there was a guy, I actually have a picture of him just shortly before the problem happened, but he found two, what I'm going to call like a gallon can of vegetables, probably tomatoes or something like that, full, unopened. And he tucked one under each arm and headed for the wire, and the guard told him to stop, and he didn't, and he was going as fast as he could go with one of these cans under each arm. And the guard shot him in the back, and he went down on his knees and threw the barbed wire. Just amazing. He obviously had practiced, and off into the bush with this huge red all over the back of his white shirt. It was horrendous to see, but there was no reason. This guy was no threat to anybody, and to shoot him in the back was just, oh my God, what am I looking at? Then the trip to Docto, there were other things that went on for a year. It was incredible. We had, during the rainy season, we had a guy drown in what was called the motor pool. The water was so deep, there was a hole or a low spot where water was over your head. He couldn't swim and drowned. That kind of thing, it was mind-blowing. It was unbelievable what we were watching. So, does that come close?
Yes, absolutely. I for the time, I'm good for as much as you want to speak. So, don't worry about that stuff. But no, that's, I think that kind of your first-hand experience gives us an idea of compared to what you expected.
Let me go into one more incident, and I'll try to say it without being overly offensive, but it was a fact at that time that the Green Berets were not issued anything, that part of their training to make them resourceful was you don't give them anything, they have to go find it on their own. So they came in, they had trucks that needed parts and everything. We would take parts off. We had a wrecking yard, a junkyard, and swap with them. And it was November, it was getting near the holidays and everything. They said, look, we have a case of steaks. If you'll bring us these parts, and they made a list, we'll give you a case of frozen steaks. And geez, okay, that's cool. Somebody made the deal, and a guy, he was from the Houston, Galveston area, and taught me a huge amount about welding. But anyway, the two of us had a 3/4-ton pickup truck with welding equipment on the back, and we were to drive these parts out to this fire base and get the case of steaks and bring them back. Well, we got out there, and there was a big event going on. And it was like, hey guys, you got to see this, boy, this is the real world. And they had brought in 3 Vietnamese women, young ladies. They had lost, the Green Berets had lost one of their guys the night before. and they wanted to interrogate these girls and everything, and they used lit cigarettes and slapped them around and whatever, and they wouldn't tell where the Viet Cong were, and I mean, you're watching this absolutely surreal thing going on, and we were all standing around like an audience, just watching people torturing these women. It was incredible. And ultimately got to a point where, and this is where I've got to be careful how I say this, but this fire base in the middle of nowhere had a fire truck, an old, beat-up OD green fire truck sitting there in the middle of nowhere, and it turned out they used it for showers and I don't know what all, but it was there, and they ended up with this one young lady using the fire hose and the pressure and everything to explode her body with water pressure to actually blow her apart. That sounds,
Yes, no.
But it happened, and the spray when her body gave up, when she died, sprayed all of us and sprayed across my face. And when I talk with young people, I try to tell them, after almost 50 years washing my face so many times every day, I can't wash that stain away. You were absolutely in the middle of nowhere with these macho guys, and you couldn't say anything, you couldn't do anything. We got in the truck and left and just went, oh my God, what did we just see? And the hard part of the whole thing, obviously, is that you were there on the other side of the world. I was, at that time, a PFC, private first class, no authority, no nothing. You grin and take it and keep your mouth shut, and tomorrow will be another day, and it'll probably be just as unbelievable as today was. And there was no way out. You were trapped. You were serving a sentence just like a guy in prison. For the Army, it was 365 days. The Marines, it was 13 months, but you were trapped in this thing and just trying to survive, and it was a very, very emotionally scarring experience. It was awful, and there were all kinds of things that we saw time after time after time that just blew you away. But there was no way out. All you could do was try to survive, try not to in any way endanger your buddies, the guys around you. We were very close. At that point, there was virtually no race tension in the military. We kept our friends alive, they kept us alive. We were all in it together, so it was just a very, very extreme experience for a kid that grew up on a farm in western New York. There had never been anything like it, and certainly no training or preparation for the horrendous things we saw that would help us to deal with that at the moment or later on. So the seeds of PTSD were everywhere, and it was just something to be endured to try to survive. There was no feeling, oh boy, I am serving my country and doing a wonderful patriotic thing and making America stronger or better. It was just, oh, I'm caught in the middle of a nightmare. If I can survive long enough, I'll get on a plane and go back to real life, and this movie will be over and everything will be good again. And of course, that wasn't entirely realistic, but we were damn young and inexperienced and trying to just make the very best of what we had, and it was a huge challenge just to stay sane and try to keep focused on going home.
Right. So you go through this, and now you come home. You had left a country that you talked a lot about 60s idealism, and you come back after this experience back to the land of plenty, which is the United States. What did your experiences there, how did that change your impression, if it did, of the United States as you returned? And do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like coming back, and then we'll start to talk about your experience and how that compares to what Ken Burns was showing in his film.
All right. What you must be aware of, I did things a little different than a lot of people. I, again, enlisted, so instead of 2 years in the Army, if I'd been drafted, I had 3 years. So when it was getting toward time for me to leave Vietnam, I would have 15 months left to do in the Army, and we were hearing horrendous things about the United States and what was going on with the protests and all of that. This is, I left Vietnam in September of '68. And you can imagine with the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, the Democratic National Convention and war in the streets of Chicago and everything that was going on, it was like, I don't want to go back home and be assigned to stand on the steps of the Pentagon and hold a bayonet loaded rifle against the protesters, because I'm now very, very much on their side. This was a horrendous, terrible thing, and should be ended immediately, and to have to defend that, I just couldn't take that chance. So I volunteered, instead of coming home, to go to Thailand and spent the next year in Thailand. It gave me the opportunity to get out of the Army 90 days early and to get my head together. It's like, I liken it to a scuba diver who has to rise slowly or he gets the bends. I had that extra year of time in an Oriental Southeast Asian society, but one that was on our side, that wasn't particularly threatening, and to get my head screwed on straight before I came home. The day came, we flew home. It was incredible. You get on the plane, commercial airliner, and at one point the captain came on and said, guys, if you got windows, you look outside, we're going over Vietnam, and you can see explosions down below, and little red explosions. And then, we ate, drank, and made merry all the way back to San Francisco. I processed out at Oakland. When I was out of the Army, you had to wear your uniform home to get the Army discount on flying and everything. So I was in uniform. took a taxi with a couple other guys, and we went to San Francisco Airport. When we got out of the taxi and walked in, there were hippies everywhere, whatever you want to call, very unusually dressed people. And I'm going to say no one said a word to us, no one threatened us, spit on us, anything like that whatsoever. We walked on by, got on a plane. I flew to Dallas, and then from Dallas to Detroit, and from Detroit to Rochester, New York. I was a little bit horrified in Dallas, had the opportunity to go out kind of into the airport where they had restaurants and things like that, and there was a souvenir stand selling postcards of John Kennedy in the Lincoln with Jacqueline just moments before he was shot and everything. I thought, my God, that's not something that you send a postcard home. I was there, but anyway, it was a very strange, emotional time. I came home. I had had a lot of time and done a lot of thinking about what am I going to do? How am I going to go on with life from this point? Most of my high school classmates had gone on to college. I had not. I'd gone to that other place. How am I going to do this? And I wanted to get a job. I had done a tremendous amount of welding. I felt like I had sand in my eyes. I didn't really want to do that anymore. So I'd have to see what there was. I came home. I bought a new set of drums and started looking for a job, and I ended up getting a job as a new and used car salesman at a Volvo, Fiat, Triumph, Jaguar, Saab, Lotus dealership, and tried to form a life. Now, when I was in Vietnam, back in Rochester, New York, there was a young lady that was going to nursing school at one of the hospitals, and one night a lady came into their dorm from a group called Operation Morale and said, we're encouraging people to write and send care packages and so forth to guys from this area that are in Vietnam. She had a whole list of names, addresses, and each of the girls closed their eyes and ran their finger down the list and chose 3 guys to write to. And the young lady chose my name. She wasn't thrilled. She had 2 lieutenants, and I was a PFC, but everybody said, well, you chose him. You got to write to him. So she started writing me letters. And when I got home, I looked her up, and within a year, we were married and have been married for more than 47 years. So that's a interesting part of the story.
Definitely.
There was a huge amount of anti-war activity. Everybody was tired of it. Nobody could justify it. It was, if you were under, I'm going to say 30 or 40 years old, you were involved in it, and it was just a tremendous nationwide focus that we've got to get out of this place. There's the rock and roll influence again, but we've got to stop this war. This is just incredible. And you got into things like Kent State and so forth. It was just, oh my God, what is happening to our country? Where do we go from here? How do you earn a living? How do you take part in what's really important to protest the war? How do you balance all these things and go forward? It was a very difficult, traumatic time.
Okay, so here we are 50 years later. Let's talk a little bit about. Let's try to compare what Ken Burns has shown in his 18 hours uh, compared to your experience or what you feel is left out. I think a lot of people. Well, you wrote something in your article that the Ken Burns series is delivered to my living room with all the slick advertising and hype of a delivered pizza. Like the abhorrent draft notice that showed up in my mailbox half century ago, this series is supposedly too important to ignore. So what is your feeling about, you've got the build up for the Burns series, you've got the government is doing these kind of 50th anniversary commemorations. Um, what is your feeling about such commemorations compared to your experience? Do you feel they're giving an honest voice to what you experienced?
Yes and no. It's never going to be perfect unless somebody followed me around. I think overall the Ken Burns series was probably good. It was certainly important that it gave voice to the Vietnamese and some things that most of America has not been exposed to, and there was a theme throughout all of it of sadness and disillusionment with the GIs, people that were there. I loved that it had the recordings of Johnson talking to McNamara or Richard Nixon with Kissinger, and made it clear how from the very top the focus was to mislead the American people, to put a spin on it, to present certain facts and not others, and not tell the whole truth, to carry on that war regardless of whatever. We must not let those protesters get in the way of our war. And I thought that was horrendous. There were a lot of things that were missing.
Would you want you? Sorry. I just want to read. You said in your article again. You said this is nostalgia, focus on old film clips and memories or impressions of a few survivors. But he fails to recognize the despair and He recognizes the despair and disillusionment of a few soldiers, but does not dare to explain the corruption, profiteering, mismanagement, attitudes, or strategic blunders that destroyed morale throughout the Vietnam era military. So what could he have done? What could Burns have done to kind of show some of the bigger picture things, or what do you think some of the things that were missing?
Well, I am convinced that John F. Kennedy was eliminated by forces within the CIA, the FBI, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, because he was not a warmonger. He had started into his presidency being a Cold War believer and all of that, but by the time the Cuban Missile Crisis, he communicated with Khrushchev offline in a series of secret communications that didn't come to light until just a few years ago. And they agreed, they both were younger fathers with children, and agreed that, we cannot just allow things to get out of hand and have a nuclear war that eliminates all of life on this planet. We've got to find a better way. And so they found ways to avert disaster with the Cuban Missile Crisis and so forth. The warmongers, and I don't mind using that word because I think it's the only one that fits, just had a hemorrhage. They just had a fit. And when Kennedy would not assign air power to help the Bay of Pigs, when he did a ban on nuclear testing with the Russians, when he gave a speech at American University in June of '63, calling for peace and saying, if the rest of the world will work toward peace, we will. It was a landmark that made many of the warmongers very upset. There were forces within the Joint Chiefs of Staff that wanted to nuke Havana when they found there were Russian missiles in Cuba, that wanted to nuke Hanoi and maybe go right on to, we used to call it Peking, now it's Beijing. Not sure how that happened. But anyway, Communist China, if we have to, let's nuke Moscow. At one point they wanted to nuke Laos. I mean, and Kennedy made a couple of remarks and said, these people are nuts. This is craziness. So I don't think that transition of Kennedy to become a peacemaker and then the assassination to prevent him from carrying through that type of an agenda was presented well at all. They did not present the fact that Eisenhower had felt Laos was far more important than Vietnam and had installed a lot of particularly CIA activity there, advisors that were CIA. They looked around and certainly had very close ties with the mafia based on the Bay of Pigs and so forth, trying to help certain Cuban refugees to take back their country, where the mafia had a very, very lucrative casino business. So there was a strong tie between the CIA and the mafia, and they looked at this area that was known as the Golden Triangle, northern Thailand, Burma, Laos, for its huge opium growing industry. And they set up at a little village called Long Tien in Laos a factory to refine the opium poppies into opium and heroin and ship it around the world through Tan Son Nhut Air Base. This little village of Long Tien, I've seen pictures of it. It's absolutely mountainous terrain. They had 5 dirt runways, and it was the busiest airport in the world. And it was all shipments of drugs in and out through Tan Son Nhut. Nguyen Cao Ky, among others, got a percentage of the profits, and planes were not inspected or deterred in any way. They delivered drugs around the world. There was no mention of that. And those people who were personally profiting so hugely did not want the war to end. And did everything possible to keep it going, to increase it, to make sure that their business venture would not be threatened for as long as possible. That's what we were up against. The average high school kid who got drafted could not influence that in any way, but You know, he could shed his blood to lubricate the damn thing and keep it going as long as possible. And that's the shame of it all. That's the, you know, when a guy was killed over there, we said he was wasted. That's exactly what the word that should have been used. He didn't accomplish anything for our country, for Vietnam, but for a bunch of crooks who were making a lot of illicit money. You know, that's what you were dying for, and it's just a shame.
It kind of brings up a problem of that, you know, we find the country is still involved in similar wars. We could walk through the fact that the country in the 70s, when you came home and when a lot of the vets came home, was, like you said in your article, for a short while, America lost its taste for militarism and war. Then we saw Ronald Reagan sell arms to the Iranians to help a bunch of thugs in Central America commit the very crimes that ISIS commits today. How did the country go from that sense that the Vietnam War was wrong into the Reagan years and got us back today? And do you think that Burns used his film to kind of make us think about today, or do you think he missed a chance to make us reflect on Vietnam and how it relates to what we're doing today?
Well, I think he missed that opportunity overall totally. You know, the first night the Burns program came on, the lead into it when they said, "Oh, this is funded by David H. Cook." Oh boy,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah.
Bank of America and the Mellon Corporation and so forth. This is, oh boy. No, there was no tie-in to anything after Vietnam. This was a picture of Vietnam in that very time-limited context, I would say. But the idea that folks in the Pentagon learned how to manipulate and that they would do it again and are doing it again was never ever even suggested.
How did it you work with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, you work with Veterans for Peace. How was organizing going through the 80s, and what kind of things we were able to do? And then we often hear about, we hear about Grenada and trying to overcome the supposed Vietnam syndrome, which, the idea that, which for a peaceful world could be a syndrome, a sickness of some sort, is extremely bizarre. But did you see a point, maybe the Persian Gulf War, was there a point where you started to see the lessons from Vietnam kind of fade into the past in the United States?
Yeah. I think 2003, early 2003, when we had decided that we were going to invade Iraq. Worldwide, there were protests, people in the street in numbers that were totally unprecedented across this country. There just never had been that many people came out into the streets to protest, and it was ignored. There was a huge PR campaign. It's real nice to say, oh, we have a volunteer army. We don't have the draft anymore, and thank God for that. But along with that, in order to entice young people to join the military, to volunteer, there has been a huge and I think immoral advertising campaign, a marketing and merchandising campaign. George W. Bush lands on an aircraft carrier with a big sign, mission accomplished, when nothing had been accomplished. It was a sell job. It was, boy, pat yourself on the back, aren't we great, and televise it, and kids will come out and join by the droves. That was all sick. It was exactly at that time when the myth of all these hippies in the airports spitting on soldiers when they came back and abusing them took place. I will say that I believe something like that happened occasionally in a very few instances. It's totally out of character with the American people, and why the American people have allowed the Pentagon marketing people to instill this sense of guilt, this guilt trip upon us. What we did during Vietnam was so terrible, and sell that bill of goods is unconscionable. It's just ridiculous. But look at the things that have happened. John Kerry was a legitimate American military hero. He did very exceptional good work. The guys that were with him praised him. But along came the Swift Boat campaign when he tried to run for president and undermined him. Why he didn't speak up and get mad and grab a television microphone and say, this is pure bullshit, guys. You're trying to smear me. It's totally unrealistic. Why he wasn't aggressive then, I will never know. I don't understand that. But it's a number of incidents like that really changed the face of America. It became so in to be patriotic. This is 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, 2001 with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon was a key point, I think, but marketed and merchandised to the ultimate and not to the country's benefit whatsoever.
Right. So let's, do you have time for a few more questions? I don't want to keep you. I know you've got time.
Sure, I'm fine.
Okay, great. I want to go back a little, maybe I'm getting this out of order, but, you saw a lot of things in Vietnam that were very disturbing. And we have a Winter Soldier testimony. There's things like My Lai. You wrote this in your article again, that Ken Burns delivers pictures of dead people in disturbing quantities, but he does not dare to describe them as atrocities. Do you think that Burns was able to get across kind of what war does to people and what really the some of the things that were going on the American side were? In terms of atrocities, things like that.
Right. I think the program was pretty good in that respect. In every case that I can think of, the ones that certainly made an impression on me, you took a GI, a veteran, and he gave him the ability to tell his story and describe that by the end he was totally disillusioned, morally damaged, wounded by what he had seen and what he had experienced, and emerged from it as anti-war. There was the fellow John Musgrave, Tim O'Brien, Bill Earhart, just a number of people were allowed to say that. Now, a friend of mine pointed out, and he's absolutely right, all of the veterans that Ken Burns interviewed and put on television in front of us had gone to Vietnam willingly, even maybe enthusiastically, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to fight communism, I'm going to be a good patriotic American. And I will go back to my earlier statement, 95% of all the people that I saw, heard, lived with in my military experience were opposed to going to Vietnam, did everything they could to avoid it, didn't like it when they got there, were angry. I will say that sabotage on a small degree, but sabotage by those people out of anger was a factor in what happened in the war. And this idea of FTA, to hell with the Army and their war, I want no part of this, was everywhere. Everywhere. So, yeah, I think that came across fairly well. I think, he could have done so much more with it. I don't remember if the segment on the Tet Offensive was an hour and a half or 2 hours. I never sat down with a notebook and put a check mark every time he said, oh, the enemy suffered a huge defeat at the Tet Offensive. But it was numerous times. Nowhere in that hour and a half or 2 hours did he interview the average guy that was in Vietnam that felt that, oh my God, we have here another Pearl Harbor. This attack, unexpected and widespread throughout every town and village in Vietnam. Oh my God, I'm a long ways from home, and I don't know if I'm ever going to make it back, because these people, that enemy army is so much stronger than we have been told and we've been led to believe. Nowhere did Ken Burns mention the, let's call it a controversy, the fact that General Westmoreland lied about the number of enemy out there facing us just prior to the Tet Offensive. Oh boy, Westy sued CBS and almost went to trial with them, actually went to trial, but gave up the suit the first day when he discovered there were 28 field grade officers standing in line to testify against him and say, yes, this is exactly what this man did. He dropped the suit, and CBS agreed not to besmirch his honor. Give me a break. That never came up. How can that never come up? There is a military leader who sabotaged his own men, and there was no accountability whatsoever. The message to today's military leaders, the young guy that graduated from West Point and went off to Iraq or Afghanistan, he has that in the back of his mind that, boy, oh boy, the Pentagon is going to stand up behind me and I can get away with anything. There's the most blatant case in the world, and nobody did anything about it. That is so important. You talk about carrying over what we learned in Vietnam to today. That message, that precedent is so ungodly that, and then they run a series of TV commercials and say, be all you can be. Ridiculous. It's just absurd.
Let's see. Trying to look over the list of questions I got here. Let's get closer to wrapping up on this. If you had your chance for 18 hours of national television, what are the points about your experience, about your look back now at the history of the whole thing? What are the points that you would make about the Vietnam War that you would you would give to the American people and especially to the next generations?
Well, I have another book in New York in the hands of my literary agent looking for a publisher. There's a lot of things, but Vietnam told us, showed us clearly that our government will lie to us, will misrepresent the facts, will not tell us the straight truth, will do whatever it wants to do in order to wage a totally unnecessary war. You can look at it as internationally illegal, but just totally unnecessary. General Westmoreland said Vietnam was a great opportunity to test our latest weapons and strategies. Gee, that's great. 3.5 to 5 million Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian people died. The vast majority of them innocent civilians that got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, under bombs from a B-52, for instance. But there is an element that Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. When he originally wrote the script for that speech, it was the military-industrial intelligence complex that he warned the American people was becoming a very serious threat and should not be allowed to gain too much power and authority. Well, they certainly did, to the point, I think, of assassinating a president and seizing power and authority to wage their dirty war. 58,000 Americans died, 3.5 to 5 million Southeast Asians died. No one was held accountable. No one has been held accountable for the 16 years of very similar spinning your tires or quagmire, whatever you want to call the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they've been able to be successful in pulling it off. And it's a shame that the American people have allowed them to do that. Yes, it's important that through Vietnam Veterans Against the War in particular, and Veterans for Peace and other groups as we've gone on, Iraq Veterans Against the War has done a lot of really meaningful work. People have tried to speak out. People have tried to steer our country back to being a force for good in the world and not a source of death and destruction. It's a shame that peacemaking doesn't offer the profitability that death and destruction does. America now is in the business of death and destruction. Our manufacturing base is all but gone. The only thing that we export is weapons, far more than any other country anywhere in the world. I believe we're selling weapons now to 160 countries. We have a military budget that is just eclipses, I think, the next 7 or 8 countries in the world combined, but is beyond any measure. And what happens last week, Congress had a gift of another $81 billion when all they were asking for was 54. And then they tell us that, we can't afford health care, we can't afford Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, we have to cut back on those, in quote, entitlements so that, we'll have money to continue to defend America. We have 800 military bases all around the world. No other country has that. We are in the business of death and destruction. And it's a damn shame. That is not what they teach in grade school. You know, it's not what the image of America is. If you walk down the mall in Washington and look at you know, the monuments to Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington and Martin Luther King and so many people who were respectful of every human being's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, America doesn't stand for that anymore. They continue to mouth the words, but we are in the business of death and destruction. Business has been very good. A lot of people are profiting very, very much. And I don't know how it's ever going to get turned around. Some of us try, we speak up where we can and try to point this out to the American people, and I consider that my patriotic duty. I know a lot of other people that do too. We're, you know, trying to swim upstream, but at the same time, you got to do it if you're going to keep your conscience clear. So I hope that answers your question.
No, absolutely it does. It's you know, it's a lot to think about when you have these big anniversaries of an event as traumatic and complex as the Vietnam War. You know, it's this time to reflect on these things for sure. So, is there anything I missed? Do you want to, you know, just have the last word and also tell people, you know, where they can get your book and mention the name of that again?
All right, I'll do that. The other thing that I would mention is one of the things that was developed in a little bit different strain from the Vietnam War was the concept of post-traumatic stress or PTSD. Veterans recognizing that their buddies coming home were traumatized and were having a hard time, set up storefront rap centers and the opportunity for guys to talk it through with their peers and tried to help these people. The time came when the official medical community, the psycho experts and so forth, recognized something was going on out there, and they came up with a new term. Instead of shell shock or whatever, they decided we'll call it post-traumatic stress disorder. I try to make it a point, when I'm dealing with the VA, I insist that they, in my case, say it's post-traumatic stress damage, not disorder. The people who can watch, see what you see in a war, the horror and destruction and gore and all the rest of it, and not be affected are the ones with a disorder. We need to look at that. PTSD is, in the case of coming home from a war and feeling very ill at ease about what you've seen, it's a short abbreviation for conscience. People look at the horror of modern war with modern weapons and tactics, particularly the American way of fighting war, and they are damaged morally because of the overall reliance on unbelievable levels of violence. And if civilians get in the way, we're supposed to just shrug it off and say, oh, well, it shouldn't have been in the way. You know, it shouldn't have been there. That's what Chelsea Manning made available to the American people, was to show evidence of this, and was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison as a result. And thank God Obama pardoned the poor kid. That was an atrocity in itself. Post-traumatic stress damage, moral damage from war, is a very, very big factor these guys are going, and young ladies are going to Iraq and Afghanistan and being asked to do things that are blatantly immoral, that are disrespectful of the Afghan or the Iraqi people. And they come home bothered by this. It's not a disorder. It's a symptom of the moral irresponsibility of our government and what they're trying to do. Again, we're in the business of death and destruction. Business has been good. The people who are profiting will do whatever it takes to keep that in motion. And it's an atrocity in itself and does not do our country any good. 50 years from now, you wonder what will America be? What will be the payoff from all of this? I don't have very optimistic outlook for where our country's headed. It's a shame.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is.
I'm sorry. The book is called "And a Hard Rain Fell," taken from Bob Dylan's "A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall," long before anybody else credited that song with being about Vietnam. Originally it was thought that "And a Hard Rain's Gonna Fall" was about environmental threat to America and the world, but I saw a lot of things in there. Where have you been, my blue-eyed son? That I was trying to answer with telling what I had seen and what I had known and what it had felt like and what I was thinking about it. It's available pretty much in any bookstore, certainly Amazon and Barnes & Noble and those places, and it's true and it's honest, and there's a whole lot of very naughty words in there, but I find it's very popular in high schools and colleges, and I encourage people to read it. It's true and it's hard to read at times, but if you want to know what it really was like, I have done the best I could to try and describe what it was really like.
Well, thanks a lot, and I am glad to have you share your experiences with everybody who's listening and myself. So thank you very much, John. And I thank you very much for talking.
All right, David, I thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
This is Our Hidden History